So I just got off a Zoom meeting with a person who just got hired as a quality assurance engineer or test engineer at Apple. In our conversation, he told me what he needed to do to apply and get invited to an interview, how many steps there were in the process and what he did in every single interview, the questions they asked him, as well as his advice to anybody who is hoping to land a job as a quality assurance engineer at Apple. And now I'm gonna tell you, if you watch to the end of this video, I can guarantee that you will be more qualified and more prepared to ace your interview with Apple and get a job as a test engineer. Let's go. So first things first, what is this job? This job is a quality assurance engineer or a test engineer, and it's basically working on the software side of Apple. So working with Apple TVs, any subscription service, Apple News, Apple Fitness, etc., doing testing. If you're watching this video, you probably already know that. So what about the timeline? The timeline was about a month. The candidate told me at the very beginning he applied, he went to Apple's website and applied for a role. He also changed his LinkedIn to open to opportunities. Only recruiters outside of your company can see that. So do that. Change that on LinkedIn. That way recruiters, one, they get a free message to email you. Instead of it costing them anything, it is free. So people at Apple and other recruiters can email you on LinkedIn. But from the time he did that, applied at on the role, and changed his LinkedIn to open opportunities, he was reached out to, and it took about a month or so from him to go from step one to receiving an offer from Apple. Now, one last note, this person is coming from another big tech company. I'm not gonna tell you what company, but it just from a comparison sake, right? If you're coming from a smaller company or maybe you're a recent grad, your experience might not necessarily be apples to apples because this person was coming from a large tech company. Now, the interview process is three main steps. The first step is the recruiter reached out and connected. And the first interview was a 30-minute audio call. Now, I thought this was really interesting. When I talked to the candidate about this and I asked about his experience, he told me that there wasn't a lot of questions. There wasn't a lot of probing. It was mostly the recruiter telling him about the team and about what was expected. And then at the end of him kind of sharing all the information about the job, he asked if he was interested. And if he was, then he would set him up with the hiring manager. But the recruiter didn't really ask any questions. He said it was a very welcoming interview. It was mostly about selling him on the opportunity and what would be involved in his day-to-day and the team and the culture. And then finally identifying, are you interested in moving on? Now, this happened because it was pretty obvious that this person was qualified, given their past experience, given what they've already done. So the recruiter, this first phone screen, was much less about probing and digging in and a lot more about just a general connection, identifying, yes, this person's qualified. Let me tell them about the role. Are you interested? He was, they moved him forward. Now, that first interview was a phone call. The second one is with the hiring manager. It's also 30 minutes long and it is a video interview. So this happened 1 week later. So 1 week later, the candidate is now talking to the hiring manager and they discuss the responsibilities, basically of his current role. So he works at a large tech company. So he asked about the products he's involved with, the teams, the tools he used, and then he gave him the opportunity to ask questions. And that was the majority of it. So it wasn't anything where he was really digging in. In round two, again, it's more so casual conversation, talking about his past experience, asking about his resume. Time and time again, when I was talking to this candidate, he said it came back to his resume, talking about what he had done. So I'm gonna get to advice at the end, but real quick, one of the things I would tell you is you wanna make yourself very familiar with what you have done in your resume, okay? If you haven't looked at your resume and identified what you did a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and you're not ready to talk about it, that is going to be a miss for Apple. You need to be ready to talk about it. Then at the end of the interview, he gave, the hiring manager gave the candidate a chance to ask questions. And he asked the following questions. He asked about the growth for the team. He asked about the team size. He asked about work-life balance, why the role was open. He said he got that one from my videos. So if you're looking for questions to ask, check out my 27 questions you can ask in your interview video, and that should give you more than enough. But it was a lot about just, again, casual conversation, talking about his resume, talking about the company, and then giving the candidate a chance to ask questions. Now, at the end of that, he asked him for his availability for a final interview. So this is a big tell. If you reach the end of the second interview and the hiring manager doesn't ask you for your availability, that could be a sign that maybe they're not going to move forward with you. So he asked him, when are you free to do this? When can you do an interview? And he got some availability for him. And then 1 week later, he did the final interview. Now the final interview, they called it a full loop interview. It was 6 different 30-minute interviews. It started at like a little bit after noon, ended right around the end of the day, and they had 2 breaks in there. So it is a bit of a marathon. It is literally 6 hours of interviewing, a few breaks in there. It was the hiring manager again. It was peers of the hiring manager, and then people that the hiring manager worked with. So it was a lot of people who are professional, technical, and going through. Now, one of the things that this person said to me that even though it was like a very long time, he felt it was a pretty comfortable experience. They were very conversational. You know, they were very polite, welcoming, and there wasn't a lot of gotcha questions. They were really straightforward. He said it was a good experience. It was a lot about his resume, the stuff he had done in his background, and just following up and asking around that. Now, he got a call the next day, step 4, and this is the last step. The recruiter reached out to him, said, hey, the response from everybody was very positive, and they're interested in moving forward. Are you interested in working at Apple? And then they went to offer. So what I like about Apple's process is it's relatively quick. Interview, 1 week later, second interview, 1 week later, final interview. Next day, they're actually reaching out to coordinate an offer. Now let's get into the questions that they asked. Now, when I asked about questions, he gave me a handful, but first and foremost, what he said is most of the questions were based on his resume. So it's what he's done in his past and then follow-up questions, right? So if you've worked and you've done some testing on products, maybe they're gonna ask you, okay, tell me about this part of your resume. And then they're gonna follow up with question after question, digging in. And again, not in a got you type way, but more so just on the details. So the biggest piece of advice he and I, after talking to him, can give you is that you need to familiarize yourself with the work you have done in prior roles. You need to be familiar with your resume, what you did in the different spots, the different tools you used, and I would probably think about some of the bigger impact projects you were involved in, and literally go through and just kind of type up what those things were. So type like, you know, I was on this project, took this long, this was the outcome, here was the tools I used, here's what I encountered, here's what I learned, but really familiarize yourself with your resume, your accomplishments, and what you've done. That would be huge. Now I'm gonna give you a few technical questions that really stood out to him. Again, this is a test engineer role. The first technical question that really stood out to him that he was asked and he said he was a little bit surprised by, but obviously he answered it well enough because he got the job, was give me a time when there was no requirement, but you still needed to test it. How did you handle it? Now I might have butchered that language a little bit, but you're getting the gist of it, right? They're asking for an example of a time where he was required to do some testing, but there was no requirements. How would you approach that? As a test engineer with a blank slate, how would you walk into that situation and determine the requirements you need to test for? The next question, kind of the opposite. You were given too much information, but it's staggered. What would be your approach to testing? So again, these are two very diametrically opposed questions. They are opposites, but they're both kind of getting at the same thing. It's your approach to testing. One, where you don't have enough information. Two, when you have way too much information and it's not really necessarily in order perfectly. So think about these two questions and come prepared to answer them. Additionally, he was given a few hypothetical situations in which they asked him to come up with a testing plan. So the way he put this is if you're a test engineer, if you're working in quality assurance, these are probably things you're quite comfortable with and you're ready to talk about it, but I just want you to mentally prepare yourself. They're going to give you situations and they're gonna want you to respond talking about how you would approach them. They're hypothetical, but they're probably gonna be involved in things that you've done in your past or that you might be doing at Apple. Have a plan on how you would approach testing. One of the examples he said is, you know, there's a login page for the App Store. How do you come up with the different scenarios? So he mentioned that Apple was very interested in a few things. Really interested in accessibility, usability, and scalability. So as you're answering, as you're giving examples, these are things you want to come in mind. If you have experience in your past in which you can really demonstrate proficiencies in testing for these specific things, you want to bring them up as examples and be ready for questions and scenarios specifically around these things. Again, I'll say it one more time: accessibility, usability, scalability. Now in the last part, I'm gonna talk about his specific advice. So this is someone who applied, went through the entire interview process and got a very strong offer. And here's what he would recommend to future quality assurance engineers and test engineers interviewing at Apple. So he said, 1, accessibility is critical. Accessibility is critical. They asked behavioral interview questions. What was your biggest failure? Whatever you write in your resume needs to be true, and you need to be ready to speak to it. Be transparent. Be honest about your skill when it comes to your programming languages. If you were newer to a language or you're a bit of a novice, be candid, because they are literally going to ask you questions around that. So there's a few things there to unpack. 1, accessibility is going to come up over and over and over again. That behavioral interview question, what was your biggest failure? I'm gonna give you a quick advice on that. So 1, use the STAR method. So that's situation, task, action, result. Use that framework to answer your question. What was the situation? What was the task? What was the action you took? And what was the result, right? So what was the failure specifically to this task? Then follow it up by what you learned from the situation and how you were better moving forward, right? So that's the next thing. This was something I said earlier, but I'm gonna reiterate it because he put it here in his advice. Be ready to speak to the different things in your resume. It is so critical. When you have things there, they're gonna ask you, okay, tell me about this. What did you do there? What was the situation you were involved in? What were the challenges? They are going to ask about the things on your resume, so be ready to talk about them. And lastly, be transparent. He literally said to me that they're gonna ask you about your skills and competencies with certain things. Then they're going to use the information you provide them to assign the difficulty levels of questions, right? So if they ask you, how are you, with Python, right? Or whatever. But let's just say that's, they ask you about your skill 1 to 10 using Python, and you go 10. Well, then you better be ready for the hardest Python questions you can get from technical people at Apple, right? So be candid with them, be honest with them. If you're a 6, say you're a 6, because then you're gonna get 6 level questions and not 10 level questions. He was persistent on that. He mentioned it a few times, so that's something I would take very seriously. He said it was a very positive experience. He said even though it was 6 interviews in that last interview, the 3rd step, it was quite comfortable. He then reiterated, again, don't exaggerate your skill set because they will ask questions around that, and that the vast majority of questions you are going to be asked for a test engineer role or a quality assurance engineer role at Apple are around your experience and around your resume. One last piece of advice from him. Be ready with questions. So he had 8 total interviews, right? 1 with a recruiter, 1 with a hiring manager, and then 6 in that last, that last grouping of interviews. Every single person gave him the opportunity for questions. And I can tell you as a recruiter, when people give you the opportunity to ask them questions, you better have questions, and you better have good ones, and you better have multiple. I'm talking 5, 10, 15, right? Because what does it tell someone when you don't have questions prepared? 1, I'm not truly interested and invested, because anybody who is considering making such a major move would naturally have questions. Or 2, I didn't prepare. Neither one of those signals are good. You don't want to be giving off any of those signals, so make sure you come prepared with questions to ask them. It matters. There you go. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for watching. Also, you are going to be able to absolutely crush this interview. You know what is coming. It's literally laid out in front of you. So by watching this entire thing, you have put yourself in great position to succeed. Watch some of my other videos on Apple. I have a full just getting a job with Apple video that's more generic. I have a specific video guide on Apple's culture. I have a video on Apple's benefits, and I have a video on how to answer the very common interview question, why Apple? I have interviewed other people and they were all asked that question. He did not mention he was, but you might. So prepare. When you're interviewing with a company like Apple, there will always be competition. But you can stand out if you prepare the right way and interview like an expert. Thank you for watching. Good luck in your next interview. You got this.